In workshops on 6 continents, there are lathes still running that were built in the 1960s. They weigh close to 2 tons. They hold tolerance to 10,000ths of an inch on the same castings they shipped with. The machinists who operate them call them the Rolls-Royce of Lathes. They were all built in one place, a factory on Pitt Street in the West Yorkshire town of Keighley, by a company called Dean, Smith and Grace. So why did that company spend 150 years in one town and then leave? If you're the kind of person who wants to know how things were really built, Trade Archive is where those stories live. Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Nobody was paying attention to Joseph Dean in the 1860s. Born in 1825 near Barnoldswick, a small town on the Lancashire-Yorkshire border, Dean grew up in a region that was becoming the engine room of the world. West Yorkshire in the mid-1800s ran on textiles, and textiles ran on machines. The spinning frames, the power looms, the carding engines, all of them needed parts made of steel, shaped to specification, fitted together by hand. The men who did that work were called whitesmiths. They filed, they turned, they fitted. They worked iron-turning lathes and hand tools to craft the rollers and spindles that kept the mills running. Keighley itself was already becoming a center for machine tool production by the time Dean was learning his trade. The town sat in the Erie Valley, surrounded by the mills and foundries that fed the textile boom, and the local engineering firms that had sprung up to service those mills were beginning to build machines of their own. Firms like D. Mitchell and Company were already established, and the supply chains for castings, forgings, and skilled labor were deep and close at hand. It was the right place to build machine tools if you knew what you were doing. Dean served his apprenticeship under a millwright named William Park in East Morton, a few miles from Keighley. It was a traditional apprenticeship. Years of filing and fitting and learning to read a micrometer before you were trusted with anything that mattered. By the 1860s, he'd gone into business for himself in Bingley, partnering with 2 local mechanics, John Spencer and John Mitchell, under the name Dean, Spencer and Company. They built machine tools from premises just above the canal on Park Road. The business grew fast enough that by 1867, the trio moved to much larger workshops on Pitt Street in Keighley. Dean was in his early 40s. He had a working factory, a growing order book, and 2 partners he trusted. For the first time, the operation felt permanent. It wasn't. Mitchell walked out in 1869, just 2 years after the move. Spencer lasted 4 more years before leaving in 1873 to start his own firm at the Atlas Works. In the span of 6 years, both of the men Dean had built the company with had gone. He was alone on Pitt Street with a factory to run and nobody to share the weight. What Dean did next defined everything that followed. Instead of scaling back or selling up, he recruited 2 men he knew from the local trade. James Smith, born in 1834, had trained as a toolmaker's mechanic in Keighley. He understood precision work. John Grace, born in 1840 in Bingley, was an engineer with practical experience in heavy fabrication. Between the 3 of them, they had every skill the business needed and a shared appetite for risk that would have made most Victorian tradesmen very uncomfortable. The risk came fast. The trio borrowed heavily to purchase a large plot of land from the Duke of Devonshire. 3 working mechanics, borrowing money from a duke to build a factory. They called it the Worth Valley Tool Works, and they built it from the ground up. For the next decade, every penny the company earned went toward clearing that debt. But the quality of their output settled the bet. By 1883, every loan was repaid, and the factory floor had grown to 75 men and 30 apprentice boys. The firm was producing planing machines, shaping machines, slotting machines, drilling machines, and their core product, precision lathes. Their 1889 commercial catalog advertised machinery for locomotive and marine engineering, ordnance manufacturers, boiler makers, and shipbuilders. They were filling government contracts. By the end of the decade, the names Dean, Smith, and Grace were attached to machines operating in workshops across Britain and beyond. In 1898, the partnership incorporated as a limited company. It was a formal acknowledgement of something the 3 founders already knew. This was no longer a workshop run by tradesmen. It was an industrial enterprise, and all three of them were getting old. Joseph Dean, the man everyone called Old Dean, was the first to step back. He retired in the late 1880s and moved to the spa town of Ilkley, where his son ran a chemist shop. Dean had spent his working life building something from nothing, and he left the factory floor while the business was still growing. He never returned. John Grace died suddenly in 1904. His son Percy stepped into the vacancy, but the younger Grace had no interest in staying. He sold his shares to the Smith family, packed up, and emigrated to White Rock in Vancouver, Canada. Within 2 years of John Grace's passing, the Grace name existed on the factory signage and nowhere else. James Smith followed in 1906. He was 72. Of the three founders, he was the one whose legacy carried forward most directly, because he left behind 3 sons who were ready to take over. Herbert, Arthur, and Harry Smith assumed full control of the company. Old Dean, living quietly in Ilkley, outlived both his partners. He passed away in 1909 and was buried in Bingley. By then, the firm he'd started with 2 men in a workshop above a canal had been reformed as Dean, Smith and Grace, 1908, Limited, run entirely by the second generation of Smiths. An 1888 partnership dissolution notice reveals a 4th name that rarely appears in the company's official history. A man called George Ramsden, who was part of the firm before Smith and Grace carried on alone. His role has been largely forgotten. Among the workers walking through those doors in the early 1900s was a young man named Herbert Smith. He'd started on the factory floor at Dean, Smith and Grace after finishing a mechanical engineering degree at Bradford Technical College in 1907. Born on the 1st of May, 1889 in Bradley, North Yorkshire, he'd grown up locally and attended Keighley Boys Grammar School. Every popular retelling of the Dean, Smith and Grace story calls him the son of co-founder James Smith. He wasn't. His parents were John Alfred Smith and Susanna Smith. The last name is a coincidence. But his story is worth telling anyway, because it says something about what British industry did to its best people. After Dean, Smith and Grace, Herbert Smith moved through several engineering firms before landing at the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company in Bristol in 1913, working under Frank Barnwell and Henri Coanda. In March 1914, he joined the Sopwith Aviation Company as a draftsman. By the end of that year, he was chief designer. He was 25 years old. Over the next 4 years, Herbert Smith designed or led the design of some of the most important British fighter aircraft of the First World War. The Pup, the Triplane, the Snipe, the Dolphin, the Cuckoo, the Salamander. And then there was the Camel. The Sopwith Camel shot down more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter in the war. Smith's precise role in its design has been debated for decades. Tom Sopwith himself downplayed Smith's contribution, describing him more as a compiler of other people's inputs than a sole designer. But the aircraft came out of Smith's design office, under Smith's authority, during Smith's tenure as chief engineer. When the war ended, so did the aviation industry. Sopwith went into voluntary liquidation in 1920. Herbert Smith was out of work. In February 1921, he accepted a contract with the Mitsubishi Internal Combustion Engine Manufacturing Company in Nagoya, Japan, to help build their early military aviation program. Japan had been a British ally during the war. The contract was legitimate. Smith and his team designed the 1MT, the B1M, the 1MF, and the 2MR for Mitsubishi. He returned to England in 1924, and nobody in British aviation would touch him. Whether it was xenophobia, post-war politics, or simply bad timing, Herbert Smith never worked in the aircraft industry again. He married Nora Roylance in 1932, ran a hotel in Gerrard's Cross, and eventually retired to Skipton in Yorkshire. Herbert Smith lived until December 1977. He was 88. He was buried at Walton Rays Cemetery in Skipton. For years, the grave was unmarked. A headstone has since been erected. It reads, Herbert Smith, Aeronautical Genius. Beside his name is that of his wife, Anne Nora Avis Smith, 1899 to 2005. She lived to 106 and spent the last decades of her life arguing that her husband had been abandoned by his country for the crime of taking a job. While Herbert Smith was building fighter planes for the Japanese, the Smith brothers, who actually ran Dean, Smith and Grace, were navigating a different kind of upheaval, and it had everything to do with the metal being cut on the factory floor. The early 1900s brought a change in metalworking that anyone outside the machine tool trade has probably never heard of. High-speed steel. Before its widespread adoption around 1900, cutting tools were made from carbon steel, and spindle speeds were limited by the heat the tool could absorb before losing its edge. High-speed steel changed everything. Suddenly, lathes could run at vastly higher speeds and heavier feed rates. But the machines themselves had to be strong enough to handle it. Older, lighter lathes shook themselves apart under the new loads. Dean, Smith, and Grace saw this coming. Under the Smith brothers, the company made what might have been the single most important strategic decision in its history. They abandoned bespoke, custom specification manufacturing entirely and committed every resource to building a standardized range of steel-geared lathes engineered from the ground up for extreme rigidity. A 1904 article in American Machinist described one of these new machines, a 16-inch center-height lathe, removing 1,800 pounds of chips in a single hour. This wasn't a sales pitch. It was a test report, published in an American trade journal, confirming that a lathe built in Keighley could outperform anything on the market under sustained heavy-duty cutting conditions. This is where the company earned its reputation. During the First World War, the Worth Valley Works became part of the British military supply chain. DS&G halted civilian production and manufactured breech blocks for heavy artillery. On the 22nd of October 1914, the firm received a letter from Lord Kitchener recognizing their contribution to the war effort. Harry Smith, the youngest of the three managing brothers, served on the Keighley War Hospitals Committee and ran the local volunteer ambulance service for wounded soldiers returning from the front. He was knighted in the 1918 New Year's Honors. The interwar years were brutal. In the 1920s, the company had invested in an imposing new frontage on Pitt Street, built in an Art Deco style with flat roofs, smooth facades, and a stylized DSG cipher etched permanently above the entrance. It was a statement of confidence. It was also spectacularly poorly timed. The Great Depression nearly killed the company. In January 1930, a DS&G executive gave an interview to the Leeds Mercury, in which he said that British industry had been bled white by heavy taxation. He described the humiliation of watching engineering firms settle for second-hand machinery because they could not afford to buy new. The workshops that should have been ordering DS&G lathes were patching up obsolete equipment instead, running machines that were years out of date because a new lathe was a luxury nobody could justify. Orders dried up. The workforce shrank to a skeleton crew. For most of the 1930s, Dean, Smith, and Grace simply held on, running minimal production behind that Art Deco facade that now looked less like confidence and more like a monument to better days. Then came the Second World War, and the factory roared back to life. At peak wartime production, the Worth Valley Works was turning out 107 heavy machine tools every single month. That figure represented 1/5 of every lathe manufactured in Britain. DS&G machines went to every branch of the armed forces, to the Ministry of Supply, and to the Admiralty, where they were installed inside naval repair ships to fabricate critical parts at sea. The company broke with decades of tradition and became one of the first all-male engineering firms in West Yorkshire to employ women on the factory floor, using female workers as grinders and machine operators to meet wartime quotas. DS&G also personally financed a Spitfire for the Royal Air Force. Arthur Smith was gone by 1943. Sir Harry outlived him by 6 years. The last of the family line had left the building. But the company they built was about to enter its greatest era. DS&G did not make small machines. They made medium to massive industrial engine lathes, surfacing lathes, boring lathes, and precision toolroom lathes, and they built every single one of them as if it had to outlast the person operating it. The foundation was a semi-steel bed, a proprietary casting with a Brinell hardness of around 200, reinforced with internal diagonal ribbing that gave it a torsional stiffness far beyond anything its competitors offered. A DS&G lathe could take a brutally heavy cut and hold tolerance to fractions of a thousandth of an inch at the same time. That combination, rigidity under load plus precision at the spindle, was what separated DS&G from every other British lathe maker, including well-respected firms like Colchester, Harrison, Holbrook, and the giant Alfred Herbert of Coventry, which was at the time the largest machine tool manufacturer in Europe. They ran their own in-house foundry and refused to outsource core castings. They forged their own hand hammers from aged railway track because the steel had the density and temper they wanted. The canteen cutlery was stamped with the DSG logo. Every worker on the floor wore heavy white starched overalls, custom-made to the individual worker's measurements by a Keighley tailor called Speaks. Those overalls became a point of local legend. Retired fitters reported still wearing them 30 years after they had left the company because the fabric simply would not wear out. The apprenticeship system at DS&G was old-fashioned in the best possible sense. Boys started in the tool room, where they were taught hand skills from the ground up. Filing, drilling, reaming, honing, and the slow, exacting process of scraping, which involved removing microscopic amounts of metal from mating surfaces by hand until they fit with absolute precision. Once they completed their time, the company actively supported and financially backed them through further academic study. The firm ran a full on-site medical surgery staffed by company nurses, oversaw a superannuation scheme for long-service employees, and maintained such deep loyalty that workers like John Whitaker spent 50 unbroken years on the floor, starting as a 15-year-old apprentice in 1964 and retiring at 65. Consider the entry-level machine, the 13-inch swing lathe, which actually offered a 6 3/4-inch center height. In its shortest 30-inch bed configuration, it weighed 3,920 pounds. That is nearly 3 times the weight of a Colchester student, which was one of the most common British lathes of the same era. The DS&G was in a different category entirely. One of the machine's signature features was the patented fast-lock spindle nose, a quick change system fitted across the 13, 15, and 17-inch and Type 20 SB lathes that allowed operators to swap chucks rapidly without sacrificing concentricity. It was a small engineering detail that told you everything about how the company thought. Every component, down to the spindle interface, was designed to save time without losing a tenth of a thou. Their best-selling machine across the post-war decades was the 1307, a 14-inch swing center lathe that became a workshop staple across Europe and the Commonwealth. The 17-inch toolroom lathe, known as the 17T, was built to tolerances better than 1/10,000th of an inch and assembled by a specialist fitter named Tommy Williams. Custom versions were made for Rolls-Royce with hand-scraped white metal front bearings. The larger machines in the range included the 1609, the 1709, the 1910, the 2112, and the 2415. And then there was the 25P, the oil country lathe, a hollow spindle machine with semi-automatic threading built specifically for the petroleum industry. The 25P was still in demand 4 decades after it first went into production. At its peak, Dean, Smith, and Grace employed over 1,000 workers and exported lathes to Australia, Japan, Italy, the Netherlands, Turkey, Spain, Mexico, and Argentina. In 1948, the company exhibited a new range of lathes at the Machine Tool Exhibition at Olympia in London. The show generated substantial interest from Canadian buyers, opening up a North American export pipeline that ran alongside the domestic business. DS&G machines ran in railway repair workshops across Europe and in gold mines deep in the Australian outback. They equipped the engineering research laboratories at UMYST in Manchester, where academics cited the machines and published research well into the 21st century. Between 1962 and 1965, the company built an entirely new foundry, the Nelson Works on Lockholm Lane, to keep pace with demand. By the early 1960s, the workforce had reached around 700, and the company was still expanding. They adopted numerical control by 1968, running NC variants of their heavy lathes years before many British competitors attempted the transition. On machinist forums, DS&G consistently ranks alongside Holbrook and Hardinge at the top tier. One shop floor account noted that the machinists preferred these lathes above Holbrooks, Harrisons, and Colchesters. A dissenting voice argued that Holbrook, not DS&G, deserved the Rolls-Royce title. The fact that the argument still generates heat decades after production ended tells you something about the kind of loyalty these machines inspire. Now here is the part of this story that anyone who has watched the British machine tool industry already knows is coming. Facing pressure from cheaper Asian imports and lacking the capital to fund a full transition to computer numerical control technology on their own, DS&G sold to the Monarch Machine Tool Company of Sydney, Ohio, around 1973. For a while, the arrangement worked. Operating as a Monarch subsidiary, DS&G integrated American CNC systems into their platform and developed the 2000, 3000, 4000, 5000, and P-range families of computer-controlled lathes. The machines got faster and more capable. The 1508 Compact brought CNC into a smaller footprint. The P-range tackled heavy pipework with automated cycles. The American parent got access to DS&G's legendary castings and build quality, and for the engineers in Keighley, the partnership brought the kind of research and development funding that a mid-sized Yorkshire firm could never have generated on its own. But there was an irony buried in the Monarch years that rarely gets mentioned. By the late 1980s, all of Monarch's manual lathes were being manufactured by DS&G in Keighley. The American company's best-selling conventional machines were being built in Yorkshire and shipped back to Ohio with Monarch's name on them. The subsidiary was carrying the parent. That was 1990. By 1992, the global recession had crippled Monarch's balance sheet, and the executives in Ohio made a decision. They announced they were permanently closing the Keighley operation. 127 years of continuous manufacturing on Pitt Street, scheduled to end by June 1992. The machinery would be sold off. The building would be emptied. The name would be retired. From the perspective of an American boardroom, it was a line item. From the perspective of the people who worked there, it was the end of everything they'd built their careers on. The managing director in Keighley at the time refused to accept it. He scrambled to put together a management buyout, racing against Monarch's liquidation timeline. Every week that passed brought the Americans closer to selling the equipment out from under them. The funding came through at the last possible moment. The company severed its American ties, renamed itself DS&G Lathes, and started over as an independent business, smaller, leaner, about 200 employees instead of 1,000, but alive, and still on Pitt Street. For the next decade, the company survived by doing something only a manufacturer of truly indestructible machines can do. It serviced its own legacy. By the company's own estimate, over 43,000 DS&G lathes were still operating in factories worldwide. The semi-steel castings on a 1960s DS&G lathe do not degrade. They do not flex. They do not lose their geometry. Machines that old do not need replacing. They need rebuilding, and nobody knew how to rebuild a DS&G like DS&G. Then, in February 2005, a man named Nigel Granger bought the company. Granger was 46 years old. He'd started as an apprentice at Rolls-Royce in Barnoldswick in 1976, which meant he understood precision engineering at a cellular level. He also understood what the DS&G brand was worth, and he treated the revival like a restoration project. His first act was to throw out the generic DS&G Lathes name and reinstate the original Dean, Smith, and Grace identity. He rebuilt the reception area on Pitt Street in the company's original blue and gray livery. He recovered portraits of the three founders and a scale model of a 1910 lathe and installed them in the entrance hall. He expanded the product catalog, pushed new CNC machines and bespoke pipe lathes into the market, and attacked the export business. Turnover climbed from under £1 million in 2004 to £2.2 million by the end of 2005, with a forecast of 3.6 million the following year. Machinery magazine ran a cover story on the comeback. For a brief window, it looked like Dean, Smith, and Grace might actually come back. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis froze capital investment overnight. When companies stop spending money, the first thing they cancel is heavy machinery orders. DS&G's clients weren't buying consumer goods. They were buying 50,000-pound machine tools for factory floors, and nobody was fitting out new factory floors in 2009. Orders evaporated. The workforce watched a genuine, working revival get crushed by forces that had nothing to do with the quality of what they were building. That was the part that cut deepest. It wasn't that the lathes weren't good enough. It wasn't that the market didn't want them. It was that the global financial system collapsed, and a company with fewer than 50 employees had no way to ride it out. Granger fought it as long as he could, but there was no fighting a worldwide credit collapse with a firm this size. The company went into administration. Its assets were picked up by Newsmith Stainless Limited, a firm based in Robertstown, which traded briefly as Dean Smith and Grace Lathes Limited. Another name. Another attempt to keep the thread alive. In 2012, the Machine Tool Technology Group, backed by Hughes Armstrong Corporate Investment and based in Halifax, acquired what remained of the DS&G brand and assets. MTTG's chief executive, Carl Griffiths, recognized the residual value of the name and the engineering framework behind it. He invested in new products and production facilities. He talked publicly about the future of DS&G as a modern engineering company. But in April 2015, Griffiths made the announcement that Keighley had been dreading. MTTG was consolidating operations. Dean, Smith, and Grace would leave Pitt Street and relocate to Halifax. The remaining 17 staff were offered positions at the new site. Several were made redundant. The local reaction was raw. Generations of Keighley families had worked at Dean, Smith, and Grace. Fathers had brought their sons in as apprentices. The company's identity was fused with the town's identity. Keighley East Ward Councillor Doreen Lee told the press that DSG had been part of the Parkwood scene for generations and that its departure was another loss for the town. Her colleague Malcolm Slater echoed the sentiment. For a town that had already watched its textile mills close one by one, losing its most famous engineering firm felt like the final cut. Griffiths defended the move in the trade press, telling Machinery Market that the company had always had a worldwide reputation for advanced, robust, and reliable machine tools, but that it had suffered from a lack of investment over the years. MTTG had made the hard decisions necessary to take the brand forward, he said. The Bradford Telegraph and Argus ran the story under a headline about a 150-year-old Keighley business leaving town. The Pitt Street address is gone. The name above the door is different. But the machines are still out there. The company itself still operates, now as part of Belgrave and Powell Limited, a specialist engineering services group with facilities across England. They offer machine tool services, robotics, automation, CNC retrofitting, and complete mechanical rebuilds of legacy DS and G lathes. They buy back machines that are 50, sometimes 60 years old, strip them down to the bare castings, retrofit them with modern controls, and return them to active production lines. The castings are that good. The iron is that sound. A DS&G lathe sits in the Bradford Industrial Museum. Another is held in the Science Museum Group's National Collection. But most of them are not in museums. They are still at work. Ask any machinist who has ever put a cutting tool to a workpiece on a DS&G bed what it felt like, and you will get the same answer every time. It felt like the machine was not even trying, like it had been built for a much harder job than whatever you were asking it to do, like it would still be there, holding tolerance, long after you were gone. That is the story of Dean, Smith, and Grace. If you enjoyed it and would like more of this type of content, give the video a like if you haven't already and subscribe. The next video is already on screen. We'll see you there.